The cold wind swept across the Firth of Forth in the closing months of 1128, carrying with it salt spray and the promise of winter storms. Along the ancient Roman road that wound south from Edinburgh, a small column of riders moved with purpose through the Scottish landscape. At their head rode a man whose presence would alter the course of Scottish history, though few who saw him pass could have understood the significance of that moment. Hughes de Payens, first Grand Master of an order so new it had yet to receive formal recognition from the Church, had come north bearing a message that would echo through 8 centuries. He was not what the Scottish nobles expected. 9 years in Jerusalem had weathered him. His face was lined by the desert sun, his hands scarred by sword and stone alike. The white mantle that would become the symbol of his order had not yet been granted. He and his companions wore simple tunics, distinguished only by their bearing and the quality of their weapons. But it was what Hughes carried in sealed leather cases, protected against the Scottish weather, that gave his journey its true weight. Documents, maps, and knowledge acquired during those silent years on the Temple Mount, years that official chronicles passed over, as if nothing of consequence had occurred. King David I received the Templar delegation at his court with the cautious interest of a monarch who had spent his formative years in England, absorbing the political currents of a wider world. David was no provincial king. He had witnessed the transformation of England under the Normans, had seen how new orders and institutions could reshape a kingdom. When Hughes spoke of his brotherhood's mission to protect pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, David listened. But when the conversation turned to matters of land, of establishing a presence in Scotland, of creating networks that would span from the Holy Land to the Atlantic shores, something shifted in the chamber where they met. The grant of lands came swiftly. At Ballintrodoch, where the South Esk River curved through Midlothian, the Templars received their first property on Scottish soil, perhaps their first significant holding anywhere outside the immediate environs of Jerusalem. The location was not random. The site controlled access routes, sat astride trade paths, and possessed qualities that would only become apparent to later generations studying the precise geometry of Templar establishments across Europe. Within weeks of the grant, workmen were already breaking ground, laying foundations that modern ground-penetrating radar would reveal as following principles of construction that should not have existed in 12th century Scotland. But the true transaction that winter went beyond property deeds. In chambers lit by candles and warmed by peat fires, Hughes met with men whose names appear only in fragments of surviving documents. Henry St. Clair, the Baron of Roslin, was among them, a man who had fought in the First Crusade, who had walked the same blood-soaked streets of Jerusalem that Hughes had later occupied. What passed between them remained unrecorded, but the connection forged that winter would persist through generations, surfacing in architecture and symbols carved into stone, in family traditions that would link the Sinclairs to Templar legacy long after the order's official destruction. As the year turned toward 1129, Hughes prepared to depart Scotland. His mission had succeeded beyond what simple land grants could measure. He left behind more than a commandery under construction. He left the foundations of a network, agreements sealed not with wax and parchment but with understanding between men who recognized in each other something that transcended the simple categories of monk or warrior, Scot or Frank. The ships that would carry Hughes back to France were already being prepared. The Council of Troyes awaited, where Pope Honorius II's legate would grant official recognition to an order that was already spreading its roots deep into European soil. On a hillside overlooking Ballintrodoch, where the first Templar buildings were taking shape against the winter sky, workers paused in their labor to watch the Templar column depart. They could not have known that they were constructing not merely a commandery, but the first visible marker of a presence that would persist long after the order's name had been erased from official histories. The stones they laid that winter still rest beneath the village of Temple, waiting to reveal their secrets to those who know where and how to look. To comprehend what brought Hughes de Payens to Scotland in late 1128 requires understanding the extraordinary circumstances that had created his order less than a decade earlier. The Knights Templar emerged from the chaos that followed the First Crusade's capture of Jerusalem in 1099. But they were not simply another military brotherhood. Historical records from the period reveal a pattern of silence and rapid transformation that has puzzled scholars for generations. The official foundation date is given as 1118 or 1119, when 9 French knights presented themselves to King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposal to protect Christian pilgrims traveling the dangerous roads to the Holy City. Baldwin granted them quarters in what was believed to be the ruins of Solomon's Temple, the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, a site sacred to 3 religions and laden with architectural mysteries spanning millennia. Contemporary chronicles note that these 9 knights accepted no new members for approximately 9 years, conducted few, if any, military operations, and maintained such obscurity that historians struggled to account for their activities during this period. Yet when Hughes emerged from this silence to undertake his European tour in the late 1120s, he did not come as a supplicant seeking support for a struggling brotherhood. He came as the leader of an order that already possessed something valuable enough to attract the attention of the most powerful figures in Christendom. The evidence lies not in what was written, but in what happened next. The speed and enthusiasm with which donations flowed to the Templars, the unprecedented privileges they would receive, and the strategic locations where they established their first European holdings. Scotland in 1128 was a kingdom in transformation under David I. Having spent his youth in England at the court of Henry III, David understood continental politics and the value of importing institutions that could strengthen royal authority. He had already begun inviting religious orders to establish monasteries, Cistercians, Augustinians, and others who brought with them not just spiritual discipline, but also administrative expertise, architectural knowledge, and connections to wider European networks. The Templars fit perfectly into this program of modernization, but they brought something additional that made them particularly valuable. The grant of Ballintrodoc occurred in the context of David's broader strategy of consolidating control over southern Scotland. The site lay in the Lothians, a region David had secured from his brother's kingdom, and where he was systematically establishing the infrastructure of feudal governance. Templar commanderies elsewhere in Europe served not merely as military outposts but as centers of administration, finance, and communication. By granting the Templars land in Scotland, David was not simply supporting a pious cause, he was embedding his kingdom in an international network that operated with remarkable efficiency. Documents from the period reveal curious anomalies in the chronology of Templar expansion. While Hughes was visiting Scotland in late 1128, similar grants were being made in England and throughout France. This coordination suggests advanced planning that contradicts the official narrative of a humble brotherhood gradually gaining recognition. Someone was orchestrating a systematic establishment of Templar presence across Europe in the months immediately preceding the Council of Troyes, as if preparing the ground for an institutional structure that already existed in concept, waiting only for formal papal approval to become fully operational. The Council of Troyes, which convened in January 1129, has been portrayed by historians as the moment when the Church legitimized the Templars. But analysis of the attendees and the proceedings reveals a more complex reality. Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of his generation, had already drafted the Latin rule that would govern the order, a document of remarkable sophistication that drew on monastic tradition while adapting it for an active military brotherhood. The rule's 72 clauses demonstrated an intimate understanding of the challenges facing knights operating in hostile territory, suggesting that its authors possessed detailed knowledge of conditions in the Holy Land that could only come from extended experience. The papal legate Matthew of Albano presided over a gathering of archbishops, bishops, and abbots, who unanimously approved not just the Templar rule, but a series of extraordinary privileges. The order would be exempt from local laws and taxes, answering only to the Pope. They could collect their own tithes, build their own churches, and operate across all borders without interference. For a 9-year-old organization claiming poverty, the scope of these privileges was unprecedented. Either the assembled church authorities were remarkably generous, or they understood that they were formalizing something that already possessed significant power and influence. The timing of Hughes's Scottish mission becomes significant in this light. He visited Scotland immediately before the Council of Troyes, ensuring that when papal recognition came, the Templars already had properties and connections established from Jerusalem to the northern reaches of Britain. This was not opportunistic expansion following official approval. It was preparation for a transformation that had been planned well in advance. Archaeological investigation of early Templar sites across Europe has revealed architectural features that appear at locations established within years of each other, despite vast geographical separation. The circular churches, the specific proportions of buildings, the orientation toward astronomical phenomena. These elements appear with such consistency that they suggest either a shared body of architectural knowledge or guidance from a centralized source. Ballintrodoc was among the first of these sites, yet it already exhibited characteristics that would become standard in later Templar construction. The mystery deepens when one examines what the original 9 knights were doing during their silent years on the Temple Mount. British archaeological surveys in the 19th century discovered tunnels beneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, bearing evidence of medieval European excavation. Templar artifacts, spurs, weapons fragments, were found in these passages, confirming that the knights had indeed been digging. But digging for what? And if they found something, what was its nature and significance? In 2016, during routine maintenance work on the churchyard wall at Temple in Midlothian, construction crews made a discovery that would reignite scholarly interest in Scotland's earliest Templar presence. 2 carved stone slabs buried in the foundations of the wall were exposed when a section collapsed after heavy autumn rains. The stones bore markings consistent with 12th or 13th century funerary monuments, but their incorporation into a later structure suggested they had been deliberately removed from their original context and repurposed, their inscriptions and symbolism apparently deemed too sensitive or too forgotten to remain visible. Archaeological teams from Edinburgh arrived within days to document the find before conservation efforts relocated the stones for analysis. Preliminary examination revealed carving techniques and iconographic elements that corresponded to the period immediately following Hughes de Payens' 1128 visit. The stones displayed characteristics of early medieval Scottish craftsmanship, yet incorporated design elements more commonly associated with continental European tradition, particularly the geometric precision and symbolic vocabulary found at confirmed Templar sites in France and the Holy Land. This discovery came not in isolation, but as part of an accumulating body of evidence that modern archaeological methods have been extracting from sites associated with Scotland's medieval military orders. In 2020, researchers conclusively identified 2 church bells in Dumfriesshire as having been commissioned by a 12th century knight, with documented connections to the Templar establishment. The identification required extensive forensic analysis involving paleography specialists, bell historians, and consultation with heraldic experts. Victorian-era interpretations had misattributed the bells to later periods, but modern imaging techniques revealed Latin inscriptions that had been partially obscured by centuries of accumulated patina. The bells had originally hung at Sacro Nemore, Holy Wood, an ecclesiastical establishment in southwestern Scotland with recorded ties to the early Templar network. The knight who commissioned them was not merely a patron, but a member of the order itself, his identity preserved in heraldic devices that Victorian scholars had misread or dismissed. The discovery demonstrated how much evidence of Scotland's Templar presence had been overlooked or misinterpreted by earlier generations of historians, operating without access to modern analytical tools. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted at Temple beginning in 2015 revealed underground architectural features that do not correspond to documented construction phases. Beneath the existing church foundations, which date from periods well after the Templar suppression, the radar identified building layouts that align with construction principles used at confirmed Templar commanderies elsewhere in Europe. The sophistication of these earlier structures, built within decades of Hughes de Payens' visit, suggests the involvement of master masons trained in techniques that were not common in Scotland during the early 12th century. Carbon dating of organic materials recovered from excavations at the site consistently returns dates clustering in the period between 1130 and 1340, precisely the window when Templar presence in Scotland would have been most active. The finds include fragments of timber from building phases, remnants of metalwork consistent with military equipment, and traces of manuscripts that had been deliberately destroyed, leaving only charred fragments and ash layers that suggest systematic burning rather than accidental fire. The archives have yielded parallel discoveries. Research teams examining Scottish ecclesiastical records have identified systematic gaps in documentation from the period between 1128 and 1350. Monastic cartularies, registers in which religious houses recorded property transactions and significant events, display curious discontinuities. At several abbeys with known connections to Templar properties, Folios covering the critical years of Templar establishment and later suppression are missing. The pages were not lost to age or decay. Examination of the bindings reveals clean cuts where parchment was deliberately removed. In some volumes, stub edges remain visible, showing precisely where documentation was excised with surgical precision. Royal records present similar anomalies. The Scottish Exchequer rolls, which should document crown revenues from former Templar estates following the order's dissolution, contain unexplained gaps. Properties that should have been generating income appear to have produced no recorded revenue for extended periods, despite evidence from later centuries confirming that these estates remained productive. Either the revenues were collected but not recorded, or the records were subsequently removed from the official registers. French archives, when cross-referenced with Scottish materials, reveal additional mysteries. Correspondence between King Philip IV's ministers and Scottish ecclesiastical authorities regarding the enforcement of papal bulls against the Templars has been preserved, but Scottish responses are conspicuously absent from the collections where they should logically exist. Either Scotland never responded to these communications, or the responses were classified at a level that removed them from general archival access. The Vatican's own archives added unexpected evidence when a team examining 14th-century papal correspondence discovered references to Scottish ecclesiastical authorities seeking guidance on handling properties of the dissolved order, decades after the formal Templar suppression. The phrasing of these inquiries suggests ongoing complications with former Templar holdings that standard transfer protocols to the Knights Hospitaller had not resolved. The Vatican's responses, if they existed, have not been located in the sections of the archives currently accessible to researchers. Modern digital analysis of surviving manuscripts has revealed another layer of concealment. Multispectral imaging, which can detect text that has been scraped away or overwritten, has been applied to Scottish monastic documents from the 14th century. In several cases, the technology revealed underlying text that had been removed using pumice or blade, a painstaking process that indicates deliberate censorship rather than routine manuscript recycling. The fragmentary words and phrases that can be recovered reference Brothers of the Temple, properties at Ballantradoc, and similar Templar-related content that someone in subsequent centuries felt necessary to erase. The cumulative effect of these modern discoveries has been to demonstrate that Scotland's Templar history was not simply incompletely documented, but actively obscured through multiple layers of suppression spanning several centuries. The physical evidence, stones, buildings, artifacts, survived despite these efforts, buried or repurposed but not destroyed. The documentary evidence was more systematically targeted, with entire sequences of records removed from archives by hands that worked to eliminate not just specific information, but the very context in which that information would make sense. Researchers note that this pattern of suppression required coordination across institutions and generations. It was not the work of a single monarch or church official attempting to hide a contemporary scandal, but a sustained campaign extending over centuries to ensure that Scotland's role in Templar history remained obscure. The question facing modern scholars is not merely what Hughes de Payens brought to Scotland in 1128, but why subsequent authorities went to such extraordinary lengths to ensure that the full story of what he established there would be as difficult as possible to reconstruct. Reconstructing the sequence of events surrounding Hughes de Payens' Scottish mission requires assembling fragments from sources that were never meant to be connected. The challenge is compounded by the deliberate obscurity that characterized Templar activities during this formative period. Modern historians have approached the problem by cross-referencing multiple independent sources: French royal records, English ecclesiastical documents, Scottish land charters, and the sparse chronicles that mention the Templars at all during this early phase. The most reliable anchor point is the Council of Troyes, which convened on January 13, 1129. Multiple contemporary sources document this gathering, including the minutes of the council itself, which survived in ecclesiastical archives. Hughes de Payens was demonstrably present at Troyes, presenting his order for formal recognition. Working backward from this fixed date, historians have traced his movements through the closing months of 1128. English records indicate that Hughes visited London during this period, where he received grants of land that would become the first Templar establishment in England. The precise timing of this English visit remains debated, but most scholars place it in the autumn of 1128, shortly before or after his Scottish journey. The coordination of these activities, visiting both England and Scotland within a compressed time frame while preparing for the crucial Council of Troyes, suggests Hughes was operating according to a carefully planned itinerary rather than making opportunistic stops. The Scottish visit appears to have occurred in late 1128, probably November or early December. This timing is inferred from several pieces of circumstantial evidence. Scottish weather would have made travel increasingly difficult as winter approached, suggesting Hughes would have wanted to complete his northern journey before the worst of the season. The grants of land at Ballintrodoch required the king's presence and formal charter processes that typically occurred when David the Fern was holding court in the southern part of his kingdom. Records show David was active in the Lothians during this period, making such a meeting logistically possible. What Hughes actually did during his time in Scotland remains largely unknown, but the archaeological evidence provides clues. The speed with which construction began at Ballintrodoch suggests that plans had been made in advance of Hughes's arrival, or that decisions were made with remarkable efficiency during his visit. Foundations were laid before the onset of winter, a risky undertaking in Scotland's climate that implies urgency or careful coordination. The builders appeared to work from detailed specifications rather than developing designs on site, suggesting Hughes brought architectural plans with him, or that these plans had been communicated to Scotland ahead of his arrival. The connection to Henri St. Clair presents additional complexity. St. Clair, the Baron of Roslin, had fought in the First Crusade and would have known Jerusalem during the years immediately preceding the Templars' establishment. Whether he met Hughes during the Crusade or whether their first meeting occurred in Scotland in 1128 cannot be definitively established from surviving records. What is clear is that the St. Clair family maintained connections to the Templar network for generations, suggesting that whatever relationship was forged in this early period proved durable and significant. Comparative analysis of Templar establishment patterns across Europe reveals that Scotland was not simply one destination among many on Hughes's recruitment tour. The sequence of land grants suggests a strategy. France, as the homeland of most founding Templars, naturally became the order's primary base of European operations. England, with its wealth and proximity to France, was an obvious next target. But Scotland's inclusion in this initial wave of establishment, before the order had received formal papal recognition, indicates that Hughes and his advisors saw strategic value in securing a northern foothold. Modern scholars have noted that the locations of early Templar properties form a geographic pattern that corresponds to medieval trade routes and communication networks. Ballintrodoch sat astride routes connecting Edinburgh to northern England, positioned to control and monitor traffic moving through southern Scotland. The site also had access to the Firth of Forth, providing potential maritime connections. For an order that would eventually develop sophisticated financial and logistical networks, these considerations would have been more important than mere agricultural productivity. The trial records from the Templar suppression 80 years later provide unexpected insights into the order's early Scottish operations. During proceedings in 1309, Scottish witnesses testified about properties and practices going back to the order's establishment. While these testimonies must be treated cautiously, given the politically charged context and the time elapsed, they confirm that institutional memory within the Scottish Templar community extended back to Hughes's original visit. References to ancient customs and foundations laid by the First Brothers appear in these documents, suggesting that the Templars themselves preserved traditions connecting their Scottish operations to the order's founding period. Cross-referencing Scottish land records with contemporary French and English documents reveals a curious pattern. Properties granted to the Templars in all three kingdoms during this period share certain characteristics: proximity to royal centers, strategic location along communication routes, and potential for development as administrative hubs rather than merely agricultural estates. This consistency suggests coordinated planning, as if someone was designing a network with specific functions in mind, rather than simply accepting whatever donations happened to be offered. The question of what Hughes told King David during their meeting remains one of history's tantalizing gaps. No transcript of their conversations exists. No letter from Hughes describes his Scottish mission. No chronicle records David's reasoning for his generous grant. Historians can only infer from outcomes. David gave the Templars valuable land. The Templars established a permanent presence that would persist for nearly 2 centuries. and both parties appeared satisfied with the arrangement. Whatever was said in those meetings carried enough weight to convince a pragmatic king to embed a foreign military order at the heart of his kingdom's infrastructure. The timeline that emerges from this fragmentary evidence is one of calculated efficiency. Hughes de Payens did not wander through Europe hoping for support. He executed a systematic campaign to establish Templar presence in key locations before the Council of Troyes would grant formal legitimacy to his order. Scotland was not an afterthought, but an integral part of this strategy. The speed and success of his mission suggests he had powerful backing and compelling arguments that transcended simple appeals for support of a pious cause. By the time Hughes arrived at Troyes in January 1129, he could report not merely that his order was protecting pilgrims in Jerusalem, but that the Templars had already established operational presence across the Christian West. The council's rapid and enthusiastic approval may have reflected recognition of accomplished facts as much as enthusiasm for the order's stated mission. The systematic nature of gaps in medieval Scottish records becomes apparent only when attempting to trace the Templars' activities year by year. Historians examining monastic cartularies from the period have identified a pattern that transcends mere accidents of preservation. At abbeys throughout southern Scotland, Melrose, Newbattle, Holyrood, the registers that should document land transactions and significant events during the early Templar period display suspiciously clean omissions. At Melrose Abbey, whose archives are otherwise remarkably complete, folios covering the years 1307 through 1320 were removed with precision that suggests deliberate censorship rather than decay. The binding shows where pages once existed. Stub edges remain, bearing faint traces of text that multispectral imaging has partially recovered. The fragments mention brothers and properties and transfer, but not enough context survives to reconstruct complete narratives. Someone in the 14th or 15th century systematically excised any documentation that might illuminate what happened to Scottish Templars after the order's suppression. Royal records present parallel mysteries. The Scottish Exchequer rolls, which tracked crown revenues with bureaucratic consistency, become inexplicably spotty when documenting income from former Templar estates. Properties at Temple should have generated regular revenues after transfer to the Knights Hospitaller, yet the rolls show sequences of years with no recorded income. Either these estates produced nothing, contradicting all evidence of their agricultural productivity, or revenues were collected through mechanisms that bypassed official recording. Modern archival research has revealed that some missing documents were not destroyed but reclassified. In the British Library's medieval manuscript collection, researchers discovered a bundle of Scottish ecclesiastical correspondence that had been misfiled among unrelated English materials. The documents dated from 1309 to 1312 and concerned the transfer of Templar properties to the Hospitallers, but the correspondence contained revealing anomalies. Several letters referenced complications in transferring specific properties without explaining the nature of these complications. Others mentioned personnel of the dissolved order remaining at sites where, according to official records, all Templars had been arrested or dispersed. The Vatican's archives, when researchers gained access to previously restricted collections, yielded additional evidence of deliberate obscurity. Papal correspondence with Scottish bishops during the Templar suppression survived, but Scottish responses to these letters were consistently absent. Either Scotland never replied to papal directives, highly unlikely given the political consequences of ignoring Rome, or the responses were removed from the collection at some point after their initial filing. The pattern recurs across multiple Scottish dioceses, suggesting systematic rather than random loss. Paleographic analysis of surviving Scottish documents from the period has revealed another layer of concealment. Medieval scribes routinely scraped parchment clean for reuse when creating new manuscripts, but this recycling typically occurred decades or centuries after the original text was written. However, examination of 14th century Scottish religious documents has found evidence of contemporary scraping. Text was removed and overwritten, while the parchment was still relatively new. The underlying text, recovered through modern imaging technology, consistently relates to Templar properties, transactions, or personnel. In one particularly revealing case, a monastic register from Dunfermline Abbey contains prayers and liturgical notes overwritten on parchment that once bore property records. The fragments of underlying text that remain legible reference the Brothers of the Temple at Ballintrodoc and lands granted in the time of King David. The overwriting occurred sometime in the 1330s or 1340s, decades after the Templar suppression, but while living memory of the order's Scottish presence still existed. Someone felt it necessary to eliminate these records even though the order itself was long dissolved. Chronicles present their own gaps. Scottish medieval chronicles are notably sparse compared to their French and English counterparts, but this general scarcity does not explain the specific silences around Templar-related events. The Chronicle of John of Fordun, one of Scotland's major medieval historians writing in the late 14th century, mentions the Templars only in passing despite their significant presence in Scotland for nearly 2 centuries. Either Fordun had no access to information about the Templars, or he chose not to include what he knew, and subsequent manuscript traditions of his chronicle suggest that later copyists may have omitted sections they considered sensitive. Comparative analysis with English records reveals the extent of Scottish obscurity. English trial records from the Templar proceedings in 1308-1312 survive in extensive detail, documenting arrests, interrogations, property inventories, and final dispositions. Scottish records from the same period are virtually non-existent. Given that Scotland had an active Templar presence comparable to many English regions, this disparity cannot be explained by Scotland having nothing to record. The records either were never created, highly unlikely given medieval bureaucratic practices, or were systematically removed. The pattern extends to physical evidence. Church buildings associated with the Templars often underwent modification in subsequent centuries, but architectural historians have noted that alterations to Scottish Templar sites seem particularly aimed at obscuring earlier construction phases. At Temple, successive rebuildings incorporated stones from earlier structures, but arranged them in ways that disguised their original contexts. Decorative elements that might have borne Templar symbols were often positioned face down or backward in later construction, as if builders wanted to preserve the valuable worked stone while hiding its imagery. Even place names reveal attempts at erasure. Sites throughout Scotland retain names derived from Templar associations. Temple itself, obviously, but also dozens of properties with Temple in their designations. Yet supporting documentation for many of these sites has vanished. Modern researchers trying to trace the full extent of Templar holdings must rely on place name evidence because the charters that would definitively establish medieval ownership have been lost. The survival of the names alongside the loss of the documents suggests selective preservation. Local memory retained the associations that official records eliminated. The cumulative effect creates a historical landscape full of shadows. Enough evidence survives to establish that the Templars had significant presence in Scotland, that this presence dated from Hughes to Payens' 1128 visit, and that the order operated important properties and maintained operations for nearly 2 centuries. But the specific details that would allow historians to reconstruct how the Templars actually functioned in Scotland, what they did, whom they interacted with, and what happened to them after 1307 remain frustratingly obscure. Modern historians face the challenge of distinguishing between ordinary medieval record loss and deliberate suppression. Medieval documents were vulnerable to fire, flood, warfare, and simple neglect. But the pattern visible in Scottish Templar records suggests something more systematic. The gaps appear precisely where documentation would be most illuminating. The surviving fragments contain just enough information to reveal that more once existed, but not enough to reconstruct complete narratives. And the censorship appears to have occurred in multiple waves across several centuries, as if successive generations of authorities felt compelled to ensure that certain information remained inaccessible. The fragmented nature of medieval records creates not a single narrative, but multiple parallel accounts that cannot be easily reconciled. When historians attempt to map Hughes to Payens' 1128 journey and its aftermath, they encounter contradictory timelines, inconsistent witness accounts, and evidence that suggests different groups experienced and recorded the same events in fundamentally different ways. Understanding what actually happened requires examining these divergent histories and the spaces between them where truth might be hiding. French sources, particularly documents from Champagne where Hughes originated, portray the Templar establishment as primarily a French enterprise. Chronicles from Troyes and the surrounding region emphasized the Council of 1129 as the founding moment, treating Hughes's earlier activities as mere preliminary recruitment. In this telling, the Templars truly began when they received papal recognition and the Latin rule written by Bernard of Clairvaux. The Scottish mission appears in French sources, if at all, as a minor stop on a European tour rather than a strategically significant operation. English chronicles present a different emphasis. For English writers, particularly those associated with the royal court, the important development was Hughes's visit to London and the establishment of the First Templar property at Holborn. English sources portray King Henry I as a major patron, whose support legitimized the order in the eyes of Northern European nobility. Scotland appears in this narrative framework only peripherally, as a lesser kingdom where the Templars established a secondary presence after securing England. Scottish sources, frustratingly sparse as they are, tell yet another story. The few surviving Scottish chronicles that mention the Templars at all treat them as part of King David I's broader program of importing continental religious and military institutions. In this interpretation, the Templars were one of many orders brought to Scotland during David's reign to strengthen royal authority and connect Scotland to wider European networks. The establishment at Ballintroduch was significant, not because it was Templar, but because it represented successful implementation of David's modernization strategy. Archaeological evidence complicates all three narratives. The sophistication of early construction at Ballintroduch suggests that the Scottish Templar presence was more substantial than any written account acknowledges. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed building foundations that indicate significant investment in permanent infrastructure occurring within months of Hughes's visit. This level of construction required advanced planning, substantial resources, and skilled craftsmen, none of which the sparse documentary evidence prepares us to expect. Mapping these divergent accounts geographically reveals additional patterns. Templar properties established in the immediate aftermath of Hughes's 1128-1129 journey cluster in ways that suggest coordinated network design. From Jerusalem through the Mediterranean, up through France to England and Scotland, then radiating back into Iberia and Germanic territories, the locations form a web of communication and control points. Each region's local sources emphasize local importance, while downplaying connections to the broader network, creating an illusion of separate regional establishments when the pattern suggests integrated planning. Financial records, where they survive, tell a fourth story. The speed with which the Templars accumulated wealth across Europe suggests they possessed financial instruments and practices ahead of their time. Letters of credit, secure deposit systems, and sophisticated accounting methods appeared in Templar operations before similar systems emerged in contemporary commercial institutions. This financial sophistication had to come from somewhere. Either the Templars brought knowledge from the East that was unknown in Europe, or they rapidly developed innovations that would not become common for another century. The question of what Hughes actually carried with him on his journey produces conflicting accounts. Some sources suggest he brought relics from the Holy Land to impress potential patrons. Others mention documents and maps. Archaeological finds at early Templar sites have uncovered fragments suggesting the presence of texts in multiple languages: Latin, Arabic, Greek, Hebrew, indicating either a polyglot brotherhood or access to libraries whose contents transcended the Christian Latin tradition dominant in medieval Europe. Military records present their own contradictions. The Templars were ostensibly a military order, yet during the first decade of their existence they conducted virtually no documented military operations. The 9 founding knights were supposedly protecting pilgrims on dangerous roads, yet contemporary accounts of pilgrim journeys rarely mention encountering Templar patrols or protection. Either the Templars were remarkably ineffective at their stated mission during this period, or their military function was less important than their public image suggested. Architectural analysis reveals divergences between what written sources describe and what physical evidence demonstrates. Templar buildings across Europe employed construction techniques and geometric principles that appear too consistent to have developed independently in isolated locations. Someone was distributing knowledge of specific architectural proportions, spatial relationships, and symbolic elements. This coordination implies a level of central planning that contradicts the image of individual commanderies operating autonomously under loose organizational structures. The relationship between the Templars and other military orders creates additional complexity. The Knights Hospitaller had been operating in the Holy Land for decades when the Templars appeared. Relations between the two orders varied from cooperation to rivalry, yet at sites like Temple in Scotland, Hospitaller and Templar properties eventually overlapped or merged. Sorting out which order controlled what at any given time requires careful analysis of charters that often contain ambiguous phrasing or contradictory claims. Ecclesiastical records from bishops and abbots who interacted with the Templars reveal yet another layer of conflicting perspectives. Some religious authorities praised the Templars as exemplary defenders of the faith. Others expressed suspicion about their secretive practices and unusual privileges. These divergent ecclesiastical opinions appeared not just between individuals, but within the same institutions over time, suggesting that something about Templar operations provoked inconsistent responses from observers who should have had similar perspectives. The timeline of Templar growth produces mathematical impossibilities when different sources are taken at face value. French sources suggest rapid expansion after 1129. English sources claim substantial English presence by the mid-1130s. Scottish evidence indicates functioning operations at Ballintroduch within months of Hughes's visit. But accounting for the human resources, financial capital, and organizational capacity required for simultaneous expansion across these regions suggests the order had access to resources not reflected in contemporary estimates of their numbers or wealth. Genealogical research on families associated with early Templar establishments reveals unexpected connections. The same noble lineages appear as benefactors or members across multiple regions, suggesting that the Templar network overlapped with existing kinship networks among European aristocracy. These family connections created channels for communication and coordination that operated alongside official institutional structures. Hughes's meeting with Henri St. Clair in Scotland represents one visible node in this hidden network of family ties that spanned the boundaries of kingdoms and religious orders. The divergent histories begin to converge when examined not as contradictory accounts of the same events, but as multiple perspectives on a complex organizational structure that functioned differently in different contexts. The Templars were simultaneously a religious order, a military force, a financial institution, and a political network. Sources emphasizing different aspects captured different facets of the same entity. The mystery lies not in reconciling these accounts, but in understanding how a single organization could operate so successfully across multiple domains while maintaining the secrecy necessary to keep its full structure obscured from any single observer. The systematic suppression of information about Scotland's Templar establishment suggests more than routine medieval record loss. When examined in detail, the pattern reveals multiple coordinated efforts across centuries to ensure that specific aspects of the Templar presence remained obscure. The question facing modern scholars is not simply what was hidden, but why successive generations of authorities felt compelled to maintain this concealment. The first wave of suppression occurred during the Templar trials of 1307-1312. In France, England, and across Europe, extensive records documented arrests, interrogations, property seizures, and final dispositions. Scotland produced virtually none of this documentation, despite having an active Templar presence comparable to many regions that left detailed records. This absence cannot be explained by Scotland's distance from papal authority or English influence. Both powers had reach into Scotland during this period. Either the trials proceeded differently in Scotland, or someone ensured that records of Scottish proceedings would not survive. Contemporary correspondence between English and Scottish authorities hints at complications in Scotland that were not openly discussed. Letters from Edward II's ministers to Scottish ecclesiastical figures reference matters concerning the dissolved order in vague terms that suggest both parties understood contexts not spelled out in the written communication. These indirect references appear repeatedly in documents from 1309 through 1312, creating a pattern of unspoken understanding about Scottish Templar affairs that official records never explicitly address. The second wave of suppression appears to have occurred in the mid-14th century, decades after the order's dissolution. Monastic scribes systematically removed references to Templars from earlier documents, scraping parchment clean and overwriting it with unrelated content. This delayed censorship suggests that information about the Templars remained sensitive long after the order ceased to exist. someone with access to multiple monastic scriptoriums, coordinated an effort to eliminate documentary evidence, even though the institution it concerned had been dead for a generation. The third wave coincided with Scotland's religious reformations in the 16th century. Protestant reformers, eager to purge Catholic institutions, destroyed extensive monastic archives without systematic cataloging. Whether this destruction targeted specific Templar-related materials or simply caught them in broader iconoclasm cannot be determined, but the effect was to eliminate yet another layer of potential evidence. Later accounts suggest that some materials were deliberately preserved by Catholic families going into exile, creating private collections that remained inaccessible to historians for centuries. Analysis of what did survive reveals a curious pattern of selective preservation. Documents concerning Templar financial transactions, records of rents, tithes, and property transfers, survived at rates comparable to other medieval economic records, but documents concerning Templar internal operations, rituals, communications, and personnel largely disappeared. This suggests that suppression targeted not the Templars' role in Scottish economic life, but rather information about how the order actually functioned, what its members believed, and what knowledge they possessed. The architectural evidence that survived, the buildings and carved stones, underwent its own form of suppression through deliberate reinterpretation. Symbols that originally held specific meanings were explained away as generic medieval decoration. Geometric relationships in building layouts were attributed to aesthetic choice rather than functional design. The precise astronomical alignments of Templar sites were dismissed as coincidence until 20th century technology made these relationships impossible to ignore. Modern historians examining this suppression have identified several categories of forbidden knowledge that authorities may have sought to conceal. The first concerns military and strategic intelligence. The Templars maintained operations across borders during a period of constant warfare. The maps, route information, and strategic assessments they accumulated would have been valuable to any power that could access them, and dangerous to the Templars' interests if widely disseminated. Hughes de Payens' journey to Scotland in 1128 occurred along routes that the Templars would use for 2 centuries. Knowledge of these communication networks, secure harbors, and safe houses represented intelligence that multiple parties might wish to suppress for their own purposes. The second category involves financial practices. The Templars pioneered banking systems that threatened existing economic structures. Their ability to move wealth across borders, secure deposits, and issue credit challenged royal monopolies on coinage and taxation. Documents revealing the full extent of Templar financial networks and the identities of their clients could have compromised powerful families and institutions. The systematic removal of Templar financial records suggests efforts to eliminate evidence of debts, obligations, and transactions that some parties preferred to forget. The third category, and perhaps the most sensitive, concerns whatever knowledge the Templars acquired during their time on the Temple Mount. The 9 founding knights spent nearly a decade excavating beneath what was believed to be the site of Solomon's Temple. Whether they found physical objects, ancient texts, or simply architectural and historical knowledge, they emerged from this period with something that enabled their rapid transformation from obscure brotherhood to powerful international institution. What they discovered and whether they brought this knowledge to Scotland remains among the most enduring mysteries of medieval history. The fourth category involves the relationships between the Templars and other esoteric traditions. Contemporary sources note Templar interactions with Islamic scholars, Jewish mystics, and heterodox Christian communities. The order's initiation rituals, conducted in absolute secrecy, provoked suspicion even before the suppression. Whether these rituals were merely psychological training for capture, as some modern scholars argue, or reflected genuine alternative theological or philosophical traditions, any documentation of them would have been dangerous material in an age when deviation from Catholic orthodoxy could mean death. The suppression extended beyond documents to oral traditions and family memories. Families associated with the Templars faced pressures to distance themselves from that history. The St. Clairs of Roslin, who had connections to Hughes de Payens' original visit, testified against Templars during the trials, a dramatic reversal that might reflect political necessity rather than genuine opposition. Other families simply stopped mentioning their Templar associations, allowing those connections to fade into forgotten genealogical footnotes. Place names preserved what documents eliminated. Throughout Scotland, locations retained Temple in their designations, despite the loss of charters that would definitively establish the nature of these associations. Modern researchers using geographic information systems have mapped these place names and found that they cluster along medieval communication routes in patterns suggesting systematic Templar presence. The landscape itself became an archive that suppression could not fully erase. Archaeological evidence presents the most robust resistance to suppression. Buildings once constructed cannot be unmade without leaving traces. Ground-penetrating radar reveals foundations beneath later construction. Carbon dating establishes when structures were built, regardless of what documents claim or omit. Scientific analysis of artifacts provides information that written records might conceal. The physical remnants of Scotland's Templar past survived not because they were protected, but because complete physical erasure proved impossible even for determined suppressors working across centuries. The question remains: who coordinated this suppression across multiple generations and institutions? No single authority controlled all the archives, scriptoriums, and repositories where Templar information might be stored. The pattern suggests either a remarkably persistent institutional memory of what needed to be concealed, or the operation of groups that maintained themselves across generations specifically to manage dangerous knowledge. Whether such continuity actually existed or whether successive authorities independently reached similar conclusions about what information to suppress remains an open question that divides historians into camps, separated less by evidence than by assumptions about human coordination and institutional persistence. If the Templars brought secret knowledge to Scotland in 1128, that knowledge did not simply vanish with the order's suppression in 1312. The evidence suggests instead a process of deliberate dispersion and transformation, with information preserved through channels that operated outside official institutional structures. Tracing how this knowledge moved through subsequent centuries requires examining not just documents but also architectural traditions, craft guild practices, and family lineages that maintained continuity across generations. The transfer of Templar properties to the Knights Hospitaller following the dissolution created obvious opportunities for transmission. At Temple in Scotland, the site passed nominally to Hospitaller control, but many of the same individuals who had managed Templar operations continued in similar roles under new institutional affiliation. Personnel continuity meant that practical knowledge, agricultural techniques, financial practices, trade connections, transferred intact. Whether more sensitive knowledge also passed through these channels cannot be definitively established, but the Hospitallers' subsequent operations in Scotland show sophistication in areas where the Templars had previously excelled. Craft guilds, particularly those involved in stonemasonry, represented another channel for transmission. Master masons who had worked on Templar buildings carried their techniques and knowledge to new projects. The distinctive architectural features that appeared at Templar sites, specific geometric proportions, astronomical alignments, symbolic decorations, began appearing at secular and ecclesiastical buildings across Scotland in the decades following the suppression. Whether this represented simple aesthetic influence or transmission of deeper principles embedded in architectural practice remains debated among architectural historians. The St. Clair family of Roslin exemplifies how knowledge could persist through family lineages. Despite their testimony against the Templars during the trials, the St. Clairs maintained properties adjacent to former Templar sites and continued to commission architectural projects displaying suspicious similarities to Templar building styles. Roslin Chapel, constructed in the 15th century, more than 100 years after the Templar dissolution, incorporates geometric relationships and symbolic elements that scholars have linked to both Templar and pre-Christian traditions. Whether William St. Clair, who built the chapel, had access to preserved Templar knowledge, or simply drew on circulating architectural traditions, cannot be conclusively determined. Maritime networks provided another mechanism for preservation and transmission. The Templars had maintained their own fleet based at La Rochelle, and reports suggest Templar ships departed French ports in the days before the 1307 arrests. Where these ships went and what they carried remains unknown, but Scotland's position on Atlantic trade routes made it a logical destination for vessels seeking refuge beyond French and Papal authority. Harbor records from Scottish ports show gaps and anomalies during the critical years around 1307-1312, suggesting either poor record-keeping or deliberate omission of sensitive information about ships and cargoes arriving from continental Europe. Manuscript traditions reveal another layer of transmission. Medieval libraries were constantly exchanging and copying texts. Books owned by Templar preceptories before the suppression had to go somewhere after dissolution. Inventories of Scottish monastic libraries from the 14th and 15th centuries occasionally mention volumes whose origins are not explained. Books on mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and natural philosophy appearing in collections that should not have had access to such specialized materials. Whether these volumes came from Templar libraries cannot be proven, but the timing and subjects suggest possible connections. The emergence of Freemasonry in Scotland during the 16th and 17th centuries raises questions about possible Templar connections. Early Masonic lodges claimed descent from medieval craft guilds, but their rituals incorporated symbolism and narratives that scholars have linked to Templar traditions. The lodge at Kilwinning claimed extraordinary antiquity, and lodges in Edinburgh and Stirling showed unusual organizational sophistication for what purported to be simple craftsmen's associations. Whether these organizations preserved genuine Templar traditions or invented retrospective connections to enhance their prestige remains one of the most contentious questions in Masonic historiography. Family traditions passed through generations represent perhaps the most difficult form of evidence to evaluate. Oral histories and family claims about Templar connections cannot be verified through conventional historical methods, yet they represent a transmission channel that could preserve information across centuries. The challenge lies in distinguishing genuine tradition from later fabrication. Modern genealogical research using DNA analysis and systematic archival investigation has confirmed some family claims while debunking others. But many assertions remain in an evidential gray zone where neither proof nor disproof is possible. The geographical distribution of post-Templar esoteric activity in Scotland shows suspicious patterns. Locations that had Templar presence, Temple itself, Roslin, areas of Fife and Aberdeenshire, became centers for later mystical and philosophical movements. Whether this represents continuity of tradition tied to specific places, or simply reflects that sites once important for one kind of alternative institution became attractive to others, cannot be definitively established. But the pattern is pronounced enough that it cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence. Documents surviving in private collections occasionally surface with Templar connections. A 17th-century manuscript discovered in a Scottish family archive in the 1980s contained architectural drawings using techniques that matched known Templar construction methods. The manuscript's provenance traced back through several generations of the family to an ancestor who had held property adjacent to former Templar lands. How this family acquired Templar-related knowledge 4 centuries after the order's dissolution remains unexplained, but the manuscript demonstrates that some information survived in forms that never entered public archives. Trade networks that the Templars had developed continued to function after the order's suppression, though under different management. The same routes, the same ports, the same merchant families appear in records from before and after 1307. The infrastructure of medieval commerce that the Templars helped create outlasted the institution that built it. Whether this continuity extended beyond practical trade matters to include transmission of other forms of knowledge depends on assumptions about how tightly integrated medieval merchant networks were, with the religious and military orders that facilitated their operations. Educational institutions represent another possible transmission channel. Scottish universities emerging in the 15th century drew faculty from continental Europe, where Templar traditions might have persisted in academic rather than military religious forms. Professors of mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy at St. Andrews in Glasgow occasionally demonstrated knowledge that seemed advanced for their time and place. Whether this reflected connections to suppressed traditions or simply individual brilliance cannot be determined from surviving records, but patterns in curricula and unusual emphases in certain subjects have prompted speculation about hidden influences. The persistence of Templar symbolism in Scottish heraldry, church decoration, and civic architecture suggests that at minimum, visual traditions continued after the order's dissolution. Whether these symbols retained their original meanings or became merely decorative elements stripped of significance is debated. Some researchers argue that symbols can preserve and transmit knowledge even when their users no longer consciously understand their meanings, that the geometric relationships and proportional systems embedded in architectural elements could be reproduced by craftsmen who had forgotten why these particular relationships were important. By the 17th century, Scotland had become a center for esoteric and philosophical movements that scholars have tentatively linked to Templar origins. Rosicrucian manifestos, alchemical texts, and mystical tracts circulated through networks that included Scottish participants. Whether these represented continuity from medieval secret knowledge or were new inventions using medieval imagery for legitimacy divides researchers. What is clear is that Scotland developed a reputation as a place where heterodox ideas could find shelter, a reputation that might trace back to the kingdom's historical willingness to provide refuge for the Templars when other realms were persecuting them. The convergence of modern archaeological techniques, digital analysis of manuscripts, and systematic cross-referencing of scattered archival materials has produced a picture of Hughes de Payens' 1128 Scottish visit radically different from earlier interpretations. What was once dismissed as a minor stop on a European recruitment tour now appears as a strategically critical operation that established networks persisting far beyond the Templar Order's official existence. Yet even as evidence accumulates, institutional resistances and unresolved mysteries ensure that the full story remains incomplete. The breakthrough came from recognizing that Scotland was not peripheral to Templar operations, but potentially central to their long-term strategy. Geographic analysis reveals that Ballintrodoc sat at a nexus of medieval communication routes, connecting northern Europe to the Atlantic world. In an age when maritime trade routes were becoming increasingly important, Scotland's position made it valuable for any organization seeking to establish pan-European networks. The Templars did not simply accept whatever land David the Moor offered. They positioned themselves to control a strategic node that would remain relevant for centuries. Archaeological investigations using ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR mapping, and three-dimensional modeling have revealed that temples' underground structures follow geometric principles matching those at confirmed Templar sites in France and the Holy Land. These are not coincidental similarities but evidence of coordinated architectural design. Someone taught Scottish builders techniques that should not have been available in 12th century Scotland, and that teaching occurred within years of Hughes's visit. This suggests Hughes brought more than religious enthusiasm to Scotland. He brought technical knowledge and the means to implement it. Manuscript analysis using multispectral imaging has recovered text from scraped parchments that provide new details about early Templar operations in Scotland. Fragments reference brothers arrived from Jerusalem, knowledge brought from the East, and foundations laid according to ancient measure. These recovered phrases, when assembled across multiple sources, paint a picture of the Templars consciously importing practices and knowledge that they presented as deriving from Solomon's temple itself. Whether this claim was literal or metaphorical, it suggests the Templars saw themselves as recovering and preserving something ancient rather than inventing something new. The controversy erupted when researchers presented these findings at academic conferences in the early 21st century. Establishment medieval historians, trained in documentary analysis and skeptical of archaeological speculation, resisted interpretations that portrayed the Templars as anything other than conventional religious knights. The debate divided into methodological camps, traditionalists insisting that absence of documentary evidence means absence of activity, and materialists arguing that physical evidence demonstrates activity, regardless of whether documents survive to describe it. Institutional responses varied. Scottish heritage agencies responsible for protecting and interpreting historical sites found themselves caught between scholarly skepticism and public interest in more dramatic interpretations. Tourist revenue from sites associated with Templar legends provides economic incentives for emphasizing mystery, but academic credibility requires restraint in claims. The resulting interpretive materials at places like Temple and Rosslyn Chapel attempt to satisfy both audiences, presenting verified facts while acknowledging unproven theories without endorsement. The Vatican's archives remain partly closed. Researchers who have gained access report that materials relating to the Templar suppression contain tantalizing references to Scotland that are not fully explained in accessible documents. Requests to examine specific collections have been denied, with explanations citing ongoing cataloging efforts or conservation concerns. Whether this represents routine archival management or deliberate restriction of sensitive materials cannot be determined from outside the institution, but the pattern of access granted and denied has raised questions among historians about whether the Vatican possesses information about Scottish Templars that it has chosen not to make publicly available. French archival authorities have been more cooperative, but gaps remain in their collections as well. Documents that should exist based on bureaucratic conventions of the period are missing from files where they logically belong. Some researchers have noted that these gaps tend to occur precisely at points where information about Templar activities in Scotland or other peripheral regions would appear. Whether this represents targeted removal or simply reflects that peripheral matters received less systematic documentation in the first place remains disputed. The conflict between historical interpretation and institutional interest comes into sharp focus around the question of excavation. Multiple sites in Scotland, Temple itself, Rosslyn Chapel's sealed vault, former Templar properties in Aberdeenshire, contain chambers that have never been archaeologically investigated. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive technologies reveal voids and anomalies that could be systematically explored. Yet applications for excavation permits have been repeatedly denied on grounds of structural concern, religious sensitivity, or budgetary limitations. Skeptics argue that these denials simply reflect responsible heritage management, that excavating medieval structures risks damaging them, that limited resources must be prioritized for projects with clear research questions, and that speculative excavations motivated by treasure-hunting fantasies should not be accommodated. But researchers note that similar concerns have not prevented excavations at other medieval sites, when investigations seemed likely to support conventional historical narratives rather than challenge them. The selectivity in what investigations are permitted raises questions about whether some authorities prefer that certain questions remain unanswered. The broader public has engaged with these mysteries in ways that complicate scholarly research. Popular theories linking Templars to everything from the Holy Grail to pre-Columbian American voyages have created expectations that serious historians cannot meet. This has produced a backlash in academic circles, where association with Templar research can damage scholarly reputations. Young researchers are advised to avoid Templar topics despite genuine mysteries remaining, creating a situation where the most contentious questions receive the least rigorous investigation. Meanwhile, evidence continues to accumulate from unexpected sources. Private collections occasionally release documents that shed new light on Scottish Templar connections. Families researching their genealogies discover ancestors with Templar associations. Construction projects uncover artifacts that carbon dating places in the crucial early 14th century. Each discovery adds a piece to the puzzle, but the pace of new evidence is slow and the resistance to revisionist interpretations remains strong. The confrontation between emerging evidence and established historical narratives has reached an impasse. Neither side can definitively prove its interpretation with currently available materials. Documents that could resolve key questions remain inaccessible, destroyed, or not yet discovered. Archaeological investigations that could provide physical evidence are not permitted. The result is a historical mystery, frozen in a state where both conservative and revisionist interpretations can claim support from partial evidence, while neither can achieve conclusive demonstration.